The school hallway smelled like old books and lemon-scented cleaner. It was a quiet smell, a background smell, and it suited the woman who walked through it just after the final bell had rung. Her name was Clara, and she moved like someone who didn't want to be heard. Her shoes were soft-soled, her skirt a plain gray, her cardigan buttoned up to her throat. She was the librarian in the archives, a keeper of quiet things. To the students who rushed past her, laughing and shoving, she was part of the furniture a kind. Faint smile behind a trolley of books. Her day was supposed to end with the careful shelving of a new donation of 19th century sheet music. It was delicate work that required white cotton gloves. She loved this part of her job, the feeling of preserving something beautiful and forgotten. But just as she was settling into the deep silence of the archive room, the intercom on her desk gave a soft, static crackle. "Clara? Could you pop down to the main office, please?" It was the headmistress's voice, trying to sound light, but with a tightness underneath. A small knot formed in Clara's stomach. She wasn't one for popping anywhere. She was one for moving slowly, with purpose. She carefully placed the fragile music back into its acid-free box, removed her gloves, and smoothed her skirt. The main office was a world away from her archives. It was all polished floors, nervous energy, and the sharp, floral perfume of the headmistress. A woman named Miss Albright. Miss Albright was standing with two other people, Mr. Doyle, the head of the music department, and a man Clara had only seen in fundraising brochures, Mr. Charles Whitlock. Whitlock was a large man, not just in size, but in presence. He wore a suit that looked expensive in a way that announced itself, and he had a habit of looking at the room as if he were thinking of buying it. He was the Academy's most important and most unpredictable benefactor. "Ah, Clara, there you are," Miss Albright said, her smile wide and fixed. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Clara gave a small nod, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "We're in a bit of a situation," Mr. Doyle said, pushing his glasses up his nose. He was a competent man, a good teacher of theory, but he had the permanently slightly worried look of a rabbit. "For the gala this Saturday, Mr. Whitlock has made a fascinating suggestion." Whitlock cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "Not a suggestion, really. A condition." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I write big checks to this school because I believe in art, real art, not just the polished final product, but the heart of it, the humble beginning." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Clara kept her eyes on a small scuff mark on the polished floor. "So," Whitlock continued, "I want to see that heart. At the gala, before the student orchestra plays, before the champagne and the canapes, I want a short recital, performed by the staff, the teachers, the people who guide these young talents. A display of passionate amateurism." He said the last word with a strange relish. "Miss A." Albright's smile tightened. "It's a wonderful idea, of course. Truly democratic. We've already got a few volunteers. Mrs. Henderson from History is going to recite a sonnet, and Mr. Davies from Science has agreed to perform a magic trick. And we need music," Mr. Doyle jumped in, his eyes darting to Clara and then away. "Piano, specifically. The centerpiece." Clara felt the knot in her stomach pull tighter. She knew where this was going. Years ago, when she first joined the school, her file had mentioned she'd once been a music teacher. It was a lifetime ago, a different person ago. She had let people assume she taught primary school children to plink out chopsticks. "You used to teach." "Clara," Miss Albright said, her voice taking on that coaxing, no-nonsense tone she used with reluctant parents. "We're not asking for a concerto. Something simple, charming. That little Mozart piece you sometimes play in the archives when you think no one is listening." Clara felt a flush creep up her neck. She did play sometimes, late in the afternoon when the school was empty. Simple things, scales, old folk songs, the easy left-hand patterns of beginner pieces. It was a private thing, like humming in the shower. I really don't perform, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nonsense, Ms. Albright chirped. It's not a performance. It's a demonstration of school spirit. Mr. Whitlock's donation this year is particularly significant. It would mean the world to the Academy. The unspoken words hung heavily. Asterisk and your job, in your lovely quiet archive, depends on donations like his asterisk. Mr. Doyle nodded eagerly. We've assigned you a lovely little piece. Mozart's Sonata Facile. The first movement. It's perfectly straightforward. You'll have the practice room tomorrow, after 3. The piano might be a little dusty, but it'll do. Clara looked from Miss Albright's determined smile to Mr. Doyle's nervous eyes to Mr. Whitlock's expression of bland expectation. They weren't asking. They were telling. They had already decided. She was a puzzle piece they were snapping into place to complete their picture. Her quiet no was not an option they were prepared to hear. The man, Whitlock, looked at her directly for the first time. His gaze was assessing, like he was judging the quality of a painting he didn't much like. It'll be refreshing, he said, to see a real person play. Not a prodigy, just feeling. The word just seemed to echo in the quiet office. Just feeling. As if feeling were a small, simple thing. Clara's fingers, resting against her gray skirt, gave a tiny, involuntary twitch. All right, she said, the word leaving her lips before she could catch it. It wasn't agreement. It was surrender. The relief in the room was instant. Miss Albright beamed. Marvelous. Thank you, Clara. School spirit, you see? As Clara turned to leave, the conversation immediately moved on behind her to seating charts, to wine selections, to how to manage the local press. She was already forgotten, the problem solved. She walked back to her archives, but the deep, comforting silence there felt different now. It felt like the silence before a storm. Later that evening, alone in her small, neat apartment, Clara sat at her own modest electronic keyboard, the volume turned low. She placed the sheet music for the Mozart Sonata Facile on the stand. She looked at the notes. They were indeed simple, clear. A child of 10 with a year of lessons could manage it. Her right hand hovered over the keys. She played the first few bars. The melody was cheerful, uncomplicated. She played it as written, her touch light and careful. It sounded small, tinny through the keyboard speaker. She stopped. Her hands fell into her lap. She stared at the music, but she wasn't really seeing it. She was seeing a different piano, a vast, gleaming black beast under the hot lights of a stage she had long ago vowed never to stand on again. She was hearing different music, a roaring sea of sound, a complex tapestry of notes that demanded everything from a person, and then had taken everything from her. She shook her head. A quick, sharp motion to dislodge the memory. That wasn't her. Not anymore. She was Clara, the archivist. Clara, who wore soft sweaters and kept the silence. She turned the keyboard off. The silence in her apartment rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was full of the ghost of that simple, stupid Mozart tune, and the echoing voice of a wealthy man who wanted to see, just feeling. She had 3 days. 3 days to practice a piece she could play in her sleep, for an audience that would see her as a mildly amusing curiosity before moving on to the champagne. She just had to get through it. Be small, be simple, be unnoticed. That was what she was good at, after all. The next afternoon, the school felt like a different building. The chaotic energy of the students was gone, replaced by a hollow, waiting quiet. Clara walked towards the music wing, her footsteps the only sound in the long corridor. The practice room she'd been assigned was at the very end, past the main recital hall with its beautiful locked Steinway, and past the nicer rooms where the current piano teacher, a man named Robert, gave his lessons. She found the door. Room 8B. It was more of a storage closet that happened to contain a piano. She turned the key and pushed inside. The air was still and carried the faint, sweet, sour smell of old wood and dust. The piano was an upright, its dark brown wood scratched and dull. Someone had placed a single, harsh-bulbed lamp on top of it, casting long shadows in the dim room. Clara set her bag down and walked to the instrument. She lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys. They were yellowed with age, some of the ivories chipped at the edges. She pressed down middle C. The note sounded, but it was thin and slightly off, a tired sound that hung in the dusty air without any bloom. She played a simple scale. The action was heavy and uneven. Some keys stuck a little, others thudded dully. This was the instrument they had given her. For a moment, a hot, sharp feeling rose in her chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was more like a deep, old sadness, that this beautiful, flawed machine, built to make music, had been left here to become a piece of furniture, and that they thought it, and by extension her, was good enough for a charming display. She sat on the creaky stool, which was too low. She adjusted it, the metal screw grinding with disuse. She placed the simple sheet music on the stand, smoothing it out. She took a breath, settled her hands in the simple C major position the piece began with, and started to play. The Mozart came out as expected. Correct, precise, a little stiff. She played it through once, and again, focusing on the uneven keys, trying to make the dynamics smooth despite the piano's limitations. It was a mechanical exercise. Her mind was elsewhere. It was on the feel of the stiff action, on the slight lag of the dampers. Her body was remembering things her mind was trying to forget. On her third run through, the door to the room next to hers opened and closed with a bang. Through the thin wall, she heard the confident, ringing chords of a Chopin etude, played with flashy speed and a hard, percussive touch. That would be Robert, the piano teacher. He was in his room, presumably practicing for his own part in the gala. His playing was technically proficient, but it had a show-off quality to it, like he was playing for an imaginary audience already. Clara's playing faltered for a second. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her fingers, resting on the keys of her simple tune, mirrored the complex patterns from next door for a split second, a ghost movement before she consciously stilled them. She went back to her Mozart, playing it even softer, trying to disappear into the sound of the Chopin. A few minutes later, her door opened without a knock. Robert stood there, leaning against the frame. He was a man in his 40s with carefully styled hair and a brightly colored sweater. He had the relaxed posture of someone who owned the space around him. "Ah, the secret weapon," he said, his tone friendly, but with an edge of amusement. "How's the preparation going?" Clara kept her hands in her lap. "It's fine. Thank you." Robert stepped in, letting his eyes wander over the old piano with a slight smirk. "They stuck you with old Murphy here, did they? He's a beast. Fight him for every note." He walked over and, without asking, played a loud, dramatic chord. The piano rattled in protest. "See? No subtlety." "It's adequate," Clara said softly, wishing he would leave. "So, the sonata facile," Robert said, nodding at her music. "Wise choice, safe, crowd-pleaser in a simple way." He crossed his arms. "Listen, I couldn't help but overhear. You're rushing the transition into the development section. Just a bit, and your left hand is a little heavy. Makes it sound plodding." He was giving her a lesson. Unasked for. Clara felt her face grow warm. "It should be light," he continued, demonstrating on the air with his hands. his fingers dancing, graceful, like a little music box. "You want Whitlock to see the school spirit, not a struggle." He said, "Struggle," while looking at the old piano, and then briefly at her. "Thank you for the advice," Clara said, looking down at the yellowed keys. "My pleasure. We're all in this together, right?" He gave her a final, bright smile. "Stick to the basics. You'll be fine. Nobody expects. Well, you know." He let the sentence hang, gave the old piano a pat, it was almost a slap, and left, closing the door behind him. The room felt even quieter and dustier after he left. His words echoed. Nobody expects. He was right. They expected a competent, slightly nervous amateur, a librarian filling a slot. They expected the music box. Clara sat for a long time without playing. She looked at her hands. They were ordinary hands, short, neat nails. A small scar across the knuckle of her right thumb from a long-ago paper cut in the archives. They were not the hands of a performer. Not anymore. A memory surfaced unwanted. Not of a big stage, but of a practice room not unlike this one, years and years ago. A teacher's voice, stern but kind. "You are not playing the notes. You are having a conversation. Listen to what the piano whispers back to you. Now, again." She shook her head. That was a different life. A ghost life. She placed her hands back on the keys. She started the Mozart again, but this time she didn't fight the piano. She listened to its tired voice. She played the simple melody, and instead of forcing it to be light and music box perfect, as Robert instructed, she let it be what it was on this instrument. A little sad, a little worn. She leaned into the slight stickiness of the G key. She let the thin tone of the high notes sound fragile. And something shifted. The piece was no longer just a series of correct notes to be plotted through. It became a small story. A simple, melancholy story told by a tired old piano. For a few minutes, Clara wasn't in the storage room. She was inside the music. Her fingers moved on their own, adding the tiniest breath of a pause here, the faintest emphasis there. It was still the sonata facile, but it was alive. The door creaked. Clara's hands froze, the spell broken. She turned, her heart jumping. A student stood in the doorway, a lanky boy with a violin case in one hand. He looked embarrassed, caught. "Sorry," he mumbled. "I was. The practice schedule on the board said this room was free at 4:30. I can come back." "No, it's all right," Clara said quickly, folding the music shut. "My time is up?" She was flustered. How much had he heard? Had he heard her playing it properly? Or had he heard that moment when it had almost become something else? The boy lingered for a second. "It sounded different," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Different?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Yeah, just not like how Mr. Robert makes us play it." He shifted his weight. "It sounded kinda lonely, in a good way." He blushed then, as if he'd said too much, and hurried away down the hall. Clara packed her bag with trembling hands. Lonely in a good way. The phrase stuck with her. She turned off the harsh lamp, plunging the room into deep shadow. The old piano was just a dark shape again. As she walked back through the silent school, the encounter replayed in her mind. Robert's condescending advice. The student's unexpected, perceptive comment. The feel of the old keys under her fingers when she had stopped thinking and just listened. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her stomach. The fear of the lights, the eyes, the expectant silence of a crowd. But underneath it, something else had been stirred up. A tiny, fragile spark of defiance. They wanted a simple, charming performance. They expected a music box, but as she walked into the clean, silent order of her archive, she knew with a cold certainty that the old piano in room 8B and the ghost in her own hands had other ideas. The problem wasn't that she couldn't play the piece. The problem was that she might not be able to play it their way. The day of the gala arrived wrapped in a cold, drizzling rain. It did not feel like a day for music or celebration. It felt like a day to stay inside, to make tea, and to listen to the patter against the window. Clara, however, was standing in her small bedroom, looking at the dress laid out on her bed. It was a simple navy blue dress, bought years ago for a cousin's wedding. It was modest, with sleeves that came to her elbows and a hem that fell well below her knees. It was the kind of dress meant to not be noticed. She had thought it perfect. Now, as she put it on, it felt like a costume, and not a very convincing one. She was playing the part of the librarian who performs a little, and the dress was her uniform. The school, when she arrived that evening, was transformed. The hallway she usually walked in quiet solitude was a river of light and sound. Round tables covered in white cloths filled the gymnasium. Twinkling fairy lights were strewn everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of perfume, roasted meat from the catering trays, and the waxy scent of hundreds of candles. People in fine clothes stood in clusters, their laughter loud and sharp. Clara felt like she was moving through a dream, a very noisy, bright dream where she didn't belong. She kept to the edges of the room, a shadow in navy blue. She saw Miss Albright gliding from group to group, her laughter the highest and brightest of all. She saw Mr. Doyle, looking more rabbit-like than ever, in an ill-fitting tuxedo, nervously adjusting his bow tie. And she saw Mr. Whitlock, the center of a small planet of admirers, holding a glass of something amber and throwing his head back to laugh at his own joke. Small stage had been set up at the front of the room. On it sat the beautiful, glossy Steinway from the recital hall. Under the lights, its black lacquer shone like a deep pool of oil. It looked immense, powerful. It was the opposite of the old, tired piano in the practice room. The staff recital was scheduled just before dinner was served, a light amuse-bouche of amateur talent. Clara's chest felt tight. She found a quiet corner behind a large potted fern and tried to breathe slowly. One by one, the other staff members took their turn. Mrs. Henderson, the history teacher, recited a Shakespeare sonnet with great, booming drama, forgetting a line in the middle and covering it with a cough. Mr. Davies, the science teacher, performed his magic trick, making a handkerchief disappear, and then, after a worrying amount of fumbling, pulling it from his own sleeve to polite applause. Then Robert, the piano teacher, walked onto the stage. He gave a small, confident wave to the crowd. He sat at the magnificent Steinway, adjusted the stool with a flourish, and launched into a piece by Liszt. It was all speed and thunder. His fingers flew over the keys, hammering out loud, impressive chords. He played with his whole body, swaying and dipping his shoulders for emphasis. The technical skill was undeniable. The notes were all there, loud and fast and clean. Clara watched from behind her fern. She listened, and as she listened, the tightness in her chest changed. A strange calm began to settle over her, because she heard what was missing. She heard the space between the notes, which was filled with nothing but the echo of ambition. She heard the melody, which was buried under all that showy technique. It was music as argument, a statement meant to say, "Look what I can do." It was impressive, but it was not moving. The audience applauded loudly, impressed by the sheer energy of it. Robert stood, took a bow, his face flushed with pleasure. He caught Clara's eye from across the room as he stepped off the stage. He gave her a quick, tight smile that seemed to say, "That's how it's done. Good luck following that." Miss Albright floated to the microphone. And now, to conclude our delightful staff showcase, a touch of classical simplicity from our very own archivist and former music teacher. Please welcome Clara. The applause was polite, expectant. It was the sound people make before the main event, a placeholder noise. Clara walked out from behind the fern. The walk to the stage felt like it took 100 years. Her soft-soled shoes were silent on the wooden steps. The lights were blinding, hot on her skin. She could see the blur of faces in the darkness beyond, a sea of dim shapes. She could see Mr. Whitlock at his front row table, leaning back in his chair, looking bored now that the flashy piano was over. He took a slow sip from his glass dot. She reached the piano. Up close, it was even more intimidating. She pulled out the bench, the legs scraping softly on the stage floor. The sound was terribly loud in the quiet room. She sat. The bench was exactly right. The height was perfect. It was a professional instrument, waiting for a professional. She placed her simple sheet music on the stand. The pages seemed very white under the lights. She took a breath, but it caught in her throat. Her hands, resting in her lap, were trembling. She could feel the cold fear, the old enemy, rising up like a wave. It whispered of forgotten notes, of stumbles, of the terrible, silencing silence of a waiting crowd. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. They felt cool and smooth, alive with potential. She found her starting position. C major. Simple dot. She began to play. The first few notes came out thin and shaky. Her fingers felt stiff, clumsy. She played the opening phrase, but it was worse than in the practice room. It was timid, childlike. It was exactly what they all expected. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Whitlock shift in his seat, looking down at his watch. A wrong note dot. It was a simple mistake. Her fourth finger on her left hand slipped, hitting an A instead of a G. It clashed horribly with the right-hand melody. A sour, ugly sound that seemed to hang in the air of the suddenly very quiet, very attentive room dot. Someone in the audience coughed dot. Clara stopped. Her hands froze over the keys. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. It was a physical weight pressing down on her. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, feel their second-hand embarrassment, their pity. She heard Robert's voice in her head. Stick to the basics. She saw Ms. Albright's frozen smile from the shadows beside the stage dot. This was it. This was the humiliating end. She could mumble an apology, stand up, and flee into the darkness. They would all be a little embarrassed for her, and then they would move on to dinner and forget about her. It was the easy way out, the expected way out. But as she sat there, trapped in that crushing silence, something broke inside her. Not a nervous breakdown, but a dam. The fear was still there, but it was suddenly joined by a hot, clear rush of anger. Anger at the dusty practice room. Anger at Robert's condescending smile. Anger at Whitlock's bored, wealthy expectation of charming amateurism. Anger at being a puzzle piece, a prop. Anger at being told to be small. Most of all, anger at herself. For hiding. For agreeing to be less than she was. For letting the ghost win. The anger burned away the last of the trembling fear. It left behind a cold, diamond-sharp focus. She didn't stand up. She didn't apologize. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She took a deep, quiet breath, not of someone trying to calm their nerves, but of a diver about to plunge into deep water. She looked at her hands, and they were steady. She removed them from the keys, flexed her fingers once, and then placed them back down in a different position. Not the simple C major of the beginner's piece. Her shoulders settled. Her entire posture changed from one of uncertainty to one of deep, poised concentration. She didn't look at the sheet music. She closed her eyes for a single second, and then she began to play again. But it was not the Sonata Facile. It was Mozart again, but a different Mozart. The opening, singing notes of the second movement of his Piano Concerto No. 21. The famous, beautiful, Elvira Madigan melody. With her right hand, she played the wistful, soaring theme with a tone that was suddenly warm, golden, and heart-wrenchingly sad. With her left hand, she supplied the orchestral accompaniment, a rich, rolling foundation of chords that made the great Steinway resonate through the silent hall. The music that poured from the piano was not loud or showy. It was profound. It was full of a lifetime of feeling, not just feeling, but complex, layered, beautiful sorrow and quiet joy. It was technically flawless, but the technique was invisible, serving only the emotion of the piece. Every note had purpose. Every phrase breathed out in the audience. Mr. Whitlock's glass halted halfway to his lips. He slowly set it down, leaning forward, his bored expression replaced by one of utter shock. Robert, standing at the back, went perfectly still. His face paled. Miss Albright's fixed smile vanished, her mouth slightly open. The student who had heard Clara in the practice room, sitting at a table near the back, felt the hairs on his arms stand up. This was the lonely feeling he'd heard, but magnified 1,000 times, painted across a vast, starry sky. Clara played on, lost in the world she was creating. She was no longer on the stage. She was in the music. And for the first time in decades, she was finally, completely home. The final soft chord of the Mozart hung in the air of the great hall, not fading so much as dissolving into a perfect, breathless silence. It was a different silence than before. The earlier silence had been heavy with awkwardness. This one was vast, deep, and electric with wonder. Clara opened her eyes. She had forgotten where she was. The hot lights, the blur of faces, the polished wood of the piano under her hands, it all rushed back in a dizzying wave. But the fear was gone. A strange, empty calm had taken its place. She had done it. She had stepped off the cliff, and instead of falling, she had flown. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest in her lap. She did not turn to face the audience. She simply sat, looking at the piano, listening to the echo of the music in her own mind. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was not a polite patter, but a strong, solid, deliberate beat. Then another person joined, and another. In seconds, the silence shattered into a roaring, thunderous standing ovation. The sound was a physical force, rolling over the stage. Chairs scraped, people stood, their faces alight with shock and awe. Clara flinched, the noise pulling her fully back into her body. She turned on the bench, a movement that felt slow and stiff. The sight of the entire room on its feet, applauding her, was overwhelming. It was too much. It was the very thing she had spent a lifetime hiding from. Her eyes scanned the front row. Mr. Whitlock was still seated, but he was leaning so far forward, his chest almost touched the table. He was not clapping. He was staring at her with an intensity that was almost frightening, his earlier boredom completely incinerated. His eyes were wide, searching, as if he were trying to see through her, to decipher a complex code. Miss Albright had rushed to the side of the stage. Her face was a mask of confused delight. She was clapping, but her eyes were darting from Clara to Whitlock, trying to calculate what this meant, how to handle it. Clara stood up. The applause swelled. She gave a small, quick bow, not the graceful acceptance of a performer, but the jerky, reflexive motion of someone who wanted to escape. She turned and walked off the stage, her steps hurried. She needed to get away from the noise, the eyes, the crushing weight of their admiration. She didn't go towards the buzzing crowd. She slipped out a side door that led into a dim, quiet administrative hallway, the sound of the ovation muffled to a dull roar behind the heavy door. She leaned against the cool wall, her heart pounding not from nerves now, but from a kind of terrified exhilaration. She had torn open the vault of her past, and the ghost was now out, walking in the bright lights for everyone to see. She wasn't alone for long. The door opened. It was Robert, the piano teacher. His confident swagger was gone. He looked pale, almost shaken. He closed the door behind him, cutting off the last of the applause. He just stared at her for a long moment. The silence in the hallway was thick. "Who are you?" he finally asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its usual confidence. It was just a question. Clara looked at the floor. "I'm Clara, the archivist." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "No one plays like that after 20 years of filing paperwork. That wasn't just good. That was—" He trailed off, unable to find the word. "I've heard recordings by the greats that had the same authority." "What was that?" "It was Mozart," Clara said softly, still not meeting his eyes. "Don't," he said, and there was a hint of frustration, even hurt, in his voice. "Don't do that? You sat there and played the concerto from memory. You played the orchestra part, the voicing, the phrasing. That's a lifetime of study. Who taught you?" Clara finally looked up. She saw no malice in his face, just a profound and genuine shock. The condescension was completely burned away. He looked like a student who had just realized his teacher knew nothing. Before she could answer, the main door to the hall burst open. Miss Albright swept in, followed closely by Mr. Whitlock. The headmistress's face was glowing with a new, fervent energy. "Clara, my dear, that was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." She gushed, reaching out as if to take Clara's hands, then thinking better of it. "Why on earth have you been hiding in the archives?" "We had no idea." Clara said nothing. Her eyes went to Whitlock. He had stopped a few paces away, his hands in his pockets, just looking at her. His assessing gaze was back, but it was different now. It was not judging a piece of furniture, but evaluating a rare, unexpected discovery. "That," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through Miss Albright's effusions, "was not passionate amateurism." He almost smiled. "That was masterful restraint. That was someone who knows the difference between playing notes and speaking music. You let the piano sing, and then you let it whisper." His words, so much more perceptive than any praise, unnerved her more than the applause had. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Where did you study?" Whitlock asked, getting straight to the point. "I've patronized concert halls for 40 years. I know the sound of a conservatory-trained musician." "Which one?" The walls were closing in. The ghost was fully present now, demanding to be acknowledged. Clara felt the old urge to run, to deny, to shrink back into gray anonymity. But the memory of the music, the rightness of it still humming in her bones, held her steady. She took a shallow breath. "The conservatory. A long time ago. And after?" Robert pressed, his voice eager now. "You performed?" A shadow passed over Clara's face. The memory wasn't of a single stage, but of many. Not of concert halls, but of dim, smoky rooms of a different kind. "Not in the way you mean," she said, her voice distant. I played for other people. For their music. I was an arranger. A session player." The truth began to trickle out, piece by broken piece. Under their relentless, astonished gaze, the story of her other life emerged. Not as a soloist, but as a ghost in the machinery of music. She had been the one record producers and famous soloists called when they needed a complex part written, or played perfectly in the studio. She had worked in jazz clubs, in pop recording sessions, even fixing parts for film scores. She had been a musician's musician, valued for her flawless ear and her chameleon-like ability to play anything in any style. She had been in demand, well paid, and utterly invisible to the public. Why stop? Whitlock asked. His voice was quieter now. Clara looked at her hands. the ordinary hands that had just held a room spellbound. The noise of it all, she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said in years. The constant pressure to be brilliant for someone else's purpose. The travel, the emptiness of it. I loved the music, but I grew to hate the world around it. I wanted silence. I wanted to be around music that was finished, settled in its pages. Not music that was always demanding to be made. She looked up at the three of them, the stunned teacher, the thrilled headmistress, the thoughtful tycoon. The archive. It's quiet. The music there is at rest. I am at rest there. The hallway was silent again. Ms. Albright looked like she was already planning a new brochure. Robert looked humbled, and a little ashamed. It was Whitlock who spoke last. He nodded slowly, as if a puzzle had finally clicked into place. "Well," he said, a strange new respect in his eyes. "It seems I got my demonstration of the heart of art, after all. I just didn't know it would be a heart that had stopped beating for the wrong reasons." He turned to Ms. Albright, his business voice returning. "My donation stands. In fact, I'm inclined to increase it." He looked back at Clara, but on one new condition. Clara's heart sank. Another demand. Another performance. Whitlock's lips twitched. Not a performance. A position. "I want a fellowship established. For students who don't fit the standard prodigy mold. For the ones who hear music differently. I want it named for her." He gestured to Clara. "And I want her to run it. No more archives. A studio, students, sharing what she knows. Not how to be a star, but how to really listen." He didn't wait for agreement. He just gave Clara one last, long look, nodded as if a deal had been struck, and walked back towards the noise of the gala, leaving the three of them in the quiet, dim hallway, surrounded by the echoing aftermath of a truth finally set free. The week after the gala was a strange, quiet storm. The buzz in the school was palpable. Students whispered in the halls, stealing glances at the woman they used to pass without seeing. Teachers found excuses to visit the archive, their conversations laced with a new, awkward respect. Clara felt like a specimen under glass. She tried to retreat into her routine, the soft click of the lock on the archive door, the feel of the cotton gloves, the silent company of books. But it was different now. The silence felt like waiting, not like peace. The offer, Whitlock's condition, hung in the air of the small room like a changed chord that hadn't yet resolved. Ms. Albright summoned her to the office. The headmistress's demeanor was now one of strategic warmth. "Clara, my dear, we must discuss the Whitlock Fellowship. He's been as good as his word. The funds are being processed. We've identified a lovely room, the old sunroom off the east corridor. Lots of light. We can have a grand piano moved in." Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap. A sunroom. A grand piano. It sounded like another stage, just a smaller one. What would the fellowship do? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why, mentor our most promising students," Ms. Albright said, as if it were obvious. "The exceptional ones. The competition winners. Imagine the prestige." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. That wasn't what he had said. He'd said, students who don't fit the mold. He'd said, hear music differently. This was Miss Albright turning it into another trophy for the school's case. The ghost of her old life, the pressure to produce brilliance on demand, stirred uneasily. "I need to think," Clara said, rising from her chair. "Of course. But don't think too long," Miss Albright trilled. "Opportunity waits." Clara didn't go back to the archive. She walked, without really thinking, to the music wing. She paused outside room 8B, the storage room with the old piano. Then she kept walking, to the door of the main practice room. She could hear Robert inside, teaching. His voice was different, less performative, more patient. She heard him say, "No, listen. Don't just play it louder. What is the left hand saying to the right?" She moved on. She found herself at the door to the east sunroom. It was dusty and filled with broken music stands and old wilted plants in pots. But the light was indeed beautiful, falling in warm shafts through the large windows. It was a mess, but it was a quiet mess. It had potential. As she stood there, a voice spoke behind her. "They're going to ruin it, you know." She turned. It was the lanky student with the violin case, the one who had heard her practice. He looked nervous but determined. "Ruin what?" Clara asked. The thing. The fellowship." He shifted his weight. "They'll just give it to the kids who are already winning everything. The ones who play like robots." He glanced down. "My friend, she's a pianist. She doesn't play like that. She makes up her own pieces. They're weird and kind of wonderful, but her teacher told her to stop wasting time and focus on her exam pieces." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just telling the truth. It was the same truth Whitlock, in his own blunt way, had seen. "What's your name?" She asked. "Leo," he said. "Thank you, Leo," Clara said. That evening, in her quiet apartment, Clara didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the fading dusk. The ghost of her past was no longer a haunting fear. It was a pile of tools she had refused to use. She thought about the noise she had run from, the demands, the deadlines, the hollow brilliance. But teaching, sharing, listening, that wasn't the same noise. That was a conversation. The one she'd had with the old, dusty piano. The phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Clara?" "It's Robert." The piano teacher's voice was hesitant. I wondered if I could buy you a coffee. I owe you an apology. And I have some ideas. About the fellowship. If you're interested." They met at a small, quiet cafe the next morning. Robert looked tired. He stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. "I was an idiot," he said finally, not meeting her eyes. "I treated you like a beginner. I treated a lot of students like problems to be solved, not people to be heard." He sighed. "Hearing you play, it broke something open in me, too. I've been talking to some of the kids, the quiet ones, the ones who struggle with the standard stuff, but light up when you talk about film music or jazz. There's a whole underground of them." He pulled out a small, crumpled list. A few names. Next to them, he'd scribbled notes. Asterisk loves composing for video games. Fascinated by blues scales. Only plays well by ear. Asterisk. These are the ones Miss Albright's committee will never pick, he said quietly. But they're the ones who might actually need what you have to give. Clara looked at the list. These weren't trophies. They were kids. Like she had once been, lost in a system that valued one kind of sound. She made her decision. She went back to Miss Albright. But this time, she was not the meek archivist. She was the woman who had commanded the Steinway in the silence of a hall. "I'll direct the fellowship," Clara said, her voice calm and clear. "But on my conditions. I choose the students, not a committee. One choose based on their relationship with music, not their trophy case. The room is a workshop, not a showcase. And Robert helps. He understands the curriculum. I understand everything else." Ms. Albright blustered, talked about oversight, about standards. Clara simply waited, quiet and immovable. Finally, seeing the steely resolve in Clara's eyes, and no doubt thinking of Whitlock's money, headmistress relented. The transformation was slow. The sunroom was cleared, not decorated. A good, sturdy, upright piano was moved in, not a grand. Clara brought a few things from the archive. Books on music theory from different cultures, scores of modern compositions. Robert helped her soundproof the walls a little. The first meeting had 4 students. Leo, the violinist. His friend, a shy girl who clutched a notebook of her own strange, beautiful compositions. A boy who could flawlessly play any pop song by ear after hearing it once, but froze when faced with sheet music. Another girl who was fascinated by the mathematics of sound. They were all nervous, expecting another lesson, another test. Clara didn't sit at the piano. She pulled a chair into their circle. "This isn't a class," she said. "This is a workshop. We're here to explore. Tell me what you hear when you listen to music. Tell me what you wish you could play." The silence was hesitant at first. Then Leo's friend softly said, "I hear colors." And it began. Weeks turned into months. The sunroom became a hive of quiet, focused chaos. Clara did not teach them how to perform. She taught them how to listen to the piano, to each other, to the music in their own heads. She showed the pop prodigy how his ear was a superpower, and how sheet music was just another language he could learn. She helped the composer structure her colors into a piece for piano and violin. Robert would come in and drill technique. But now it served a purpose. The student understood that Clara still visited the archive sometimes. She still loved the quiet of finished things. But now she was no longer at rest. She was in motion. One afternoon, near the end of the term, she was in the sunroom. Leo and his friend were rehearsing their first duet, the one born from her color notes. It was halting, full of mistakes, but alive with the feeling that perfect performances often lacked. Clara listened, leaning against the window where the light was warm. Her eyes were closed. A small, real smile touched her lips. Robert walked in quietly and stood beside her, listening. He didn't speak for a long time. "You all right?" he whispered finally. "This is the heart of it." The piece stumbled to a stop. The 2 students looked up, anxious for feedback. Clara opened her eyes. She walked to the piano, not to correct them, but to join them. She sat beside the young composer. "That shift into the minor key, here," Clara said softly, playing a phrase. "It's like a cloud passing over the sun. It's beautiful. Let's see if we can make the cloud linger just a moment longer." Her hands moved over the keys, not with the breathtaking mastery of the gala, but with the gentle, precise guidance of a gardener tending a new plant. The music that filled the sunlit room was not perfect. It was not a finished sonata. It was a conversation. It was a beginning dot, and for Clara, for the first time in a very long time, it was enough.